August 30th, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The ruins of a once mighty empire lay smoldering beneath a gray and heavy sky. Ash still drifted in the breeze from neighborhoods reduced to charred skeletons of wood and paper. Across the water, American warships anchored like a floating city of steel, their decks crowded with sailors who peered toward the broken capital. On shore, silence weighed heavier than the rubble. In narrow alleyways, gaunt civilians searched for fragments of normal life. Rice enough for a family, charcoal enough for one more meal. Yet amid this wasteland, another scent began to drift, alien yet alluring. It was rich, bitter, dark. It was coffee. To the Japanese survivors, accustomed to the delicate, earthy aroma of green tea, the smell struck with almost physical force. Stronger, sharper, more powerful. The soldiers of the United States had brought with them not just weapons and rations, but a ritual of resilience poured steaming into battered tin cups. On that morning, in the shadow of defeat, men and women who had known only the quiet ceremony of tea found themselves staring at mugs filled with a liquid as black as midnight. For centuries, tea had been more than a drink in Japan. It was art. It was meditation. It was identity itself, leaves steeped in hot water, consumed with precision and grace. Now, in the stunned days after surrender, they watched occupying soldiers gulp down coffee as though it were fuel. No delicate gestures, no waiting, no bow, just scalding gulps, faces wincing at the burn, then grins of relief. To the Japanese eye, it was both vulgar and incomprehensible, and yet they could not look away. The first encounter often came through smell before taste. As GIs boiled rations on street corners or in requisitioned offices, the scent traveled. Civilians passing by would stop in their tracks, nostrils flaring. Children, clutching their mothers' kimonos, tugged nervously as if the aroma itself were dangerous. It was not the subtle fragrance of roasted rice tea, nor the floral calm of green sencha. It was heavier, like smoke mixed with earth. Some whispered it was medicine. Others thought it was burned grain. But when they saw the soldiers drink it with such hunger, with such casual force, curiosity gnawed at them. Could this dark potion explain the stamina of men who had crossed the ocean, leveled their cities, and now sat victorious in the ashes? In the dim interiors of requisitioned schools and government buildings, translators often witnessed the same moment, a porcelain teacup replaced by a chipped American mug. Officers extended the offering not as insult but as routine, a gesture born of habit. And when the liquid touched Japanese lips, shock followed. The bitterness attacked first, biting, unfamiliar, overwhelming. Where tea soothed, coffee demanded. Where tea whispered, coffee roared. Tongues recoiled, eyes widened, throats strained to swallow. Some spat it out instantly, laughing nervously at their own weakness. Others forced the gulp, determined not to show discomfort before the foreign conquerors. And yet slowly a realization formed. This was not weakness. This was a different kind of strength. For those who endured a second sip, another layer revealed itself. Beneath the bitterness, warmth spread like fire through the body. Energy surged, not the calm wakefulness of tea, but a sharper current. It was as if each swallow carried the memory of industry, of machines roaring, of ships launched at impossible speed. Coffee did not invite reflection. It propelled action. In that moment, many civilians saw the essence of America distilled in liquid form. A culture that thrived on urgency, momentum, and power. There are people who drank not to contemplate, but to conquer the day ahead. The contrast was almost unbearable. For centuries, Japan had built ritual around restraint. A tea ceremony could last hours, each movement perfected, each gesture symbolic. Even the smallest sip carried meaning. Now they watched as young soldiers in worn khaki swallowed boiling coffee in seconds, slammed their cups down, and strode back to their duties as if nothing had happened. To civilians, it seemed the drink itself was an explanation for America's terrifying energy. This was not refinement. This was raw fuel. Perhaps this was how factories never slept, how fleets never stopped, how an army could fight across two oceans at once. Mothers carried the tale home. "The Americans drink something darker than night," they whispered to neighbors. "It is stronger than any tea. It makes them restless, awake, unyielding." Fathers, broken by war and stripped of purpose, wondered if this strange drink was the secret of resilience. Was coffee the reason men in steel helmets could march endlessly, laugh loudly, and rebuild with unstoppable hands? Some scoffed, dismissing it as barbaric indulgence. Others feared it was a form of magic, a weapon disguised as a beverage. Yet beneath the rubble of empire, a seed of fascination took root. There were moments, fleeting but unforgettable, when coffee and tea faced each other across the same table. In small gatherings arranged by occupation authorities, Japanese hosts offered their finest green tea with the grace of centuries. The Americans in turn poured thick black coffee, steam curling like smoke from a battlefield. Cups clinked, glances exchanged, a fragile bridge built over bitterness both literal and symbolic. Each sip was an act of surrender and defiance, a recognition that the war had ended but a new struggle, cultural survival, had begun. To the Japanese, the foreign liquid was more than a taste. It was a confrontation with defeat itself, and yet in time some began to embrace it. Exhausted workers rebuilding the shattered city found strength in its jolt. Writers, staring at blank pages in cold rooms, discovered that coffee burned away fatigue faster than tea. Students, desperate to learn English and understand the new rulers, drank it while cramming late into the night. Coffee was no longer just the drink of the conqueror. It became, slowly, a tool of endurance for the conquered. Though many would never abandon tea, the bitterness of coffee became tied to survival in the post-war years, a harsh medicine for a harsh new world. For the occupying soldiers, the astonishment of civilians seemed strange. To Americans, coffee was ordinary, as constant as breath. But watching Japanese faces contort at the first sip, then settle into grudging acceptance, they realized they had brought more than firepower. They had carried an entire rhythm of life across the Pacific, one gulp at a time. In that recognition lay a quiet truth. Culture conquers as surely as armies do. And on the shattered streets of Tokyo, where survival meant adapting to whatever strength could be found, the dark, bitter drink of the West began its slow march into the heart of the East. September 2nd, 1945. The deck of the USS Missouri floated like a steel island on Tokyo Bay. The Japanese delegation arrived in solemn silence, their faces pale, their bodies rigid. They bowed before Admiral Nimitz, General MacArthur, and the assembled Allied officers. Pens scratched across paper, and in that instant, an empire that had lasted for centuries collapsed into memory. The war was over, but the struggle for survival was only beginning. All across Japan, cities lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki incinerated, Tokyo a flattened wasteland, Osaka and Yokohama reduced to skeletal ruins. Food was scarce, industries destroyed, millions homeless. Into this shattered world came the Americans, bringing not just weapons and authority but also the routines of their daily lives. And among those routines, nothing seemed so foreign, so symbolic, as the steaming black liquid that poured into their tin mugs at dawn: coffee. The broader context of this collision was extraordinary. By 1945, Japan had fought for over a decade in near-constant war. From the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 to the conquest of China, from the sweeping victories of 1941 to the devastating defeats of 1944 to 45, the Japanese people had endured sacrifice upon sacrifice. Tea, long their cultural cornerstone, had been rationed into near extinction during the war. Many families could no longer find green tea leaves, resorting instead to roasted barley, roasted rice, or even acorns boiled in desperation. The elegant tea ceremonies of Kyoto tea houses seemed like echoes from another age, a dream buried beneath bomb craters. Into this vacuum entered something alien: American coffee, flowing freely from military supply lines that seemed endless. The Americans themselves were creatures of habit, shaped by their own culture. For them, coffee was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Every field kit contained packets of instant coffee. Every mess hall smelled of its bitter steam. A sergeant at dawn would bark for his men to grab your joe before issuing orders. For the GIs, the ritual of coffee was as ingrained as the Japanese ritual of tea, though the meanings could not have been more different. Tea in Japan symbolized harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Coffee for Americans symbolized stamina, alertness, speed, and the drive to push forward. These two beverages reflected the spirits of two nations that had collided in the most brutal war in human history. What astonished Japanese civilians was not only the taste of coffee, but the abundance of it. They had endured years of shortages: no rice, no fish, no tea. Children carried ration cards like lifelines, yet the occupying soldiers seemed to conjure supplies out of thin air. Cargo ships filled the harbors daily. Trucks rumbled through the ruins, carrying crates marked U.S. Army and Quartermaster Corps. Inside were mountains of canned food, powdered milk, chocolate, and sacks of coffee beans roasted in America's industrial heartland. The sheer scale of it stunned the Japanese. To them, coffee was not just a drink, but evidence of a nation whose factories had never stopped, whose supply lines stretched across the Pacific without breaking. Every sip was a reminder of why they had lost. The cultural mismatch ran deeper than taste. Japanese society had built its rhythm around patience. Tea was brewed carefully, poured delicately, consumed in quiet reflection. Coffee shattered that rhythm. Soldiers boiled water quickly, dumped in spoonfuls of grounds or instant powder, stirred once and drank while still scalding. There was no ceremony, no pause, no poetry. To Japanese eyes it looked reckless, even barbaric. But it was also terrifyingly efficient. The drink matched the American way of war, fast, direct, relentless. Just as Sherman tanks rolled forward without pause, just as bombers flew day and night, coffee fueled a culture that moved without waiting. Even the psychological contrast between the two beverages carried weight. Tea calmed the nerves, quieted the spirit, and reinforced discipline. It had been the drink of samurai, monks, and poets alike. Coffee did the opposite. It sharpened the senses, quickened the pulse, and seemed to ignite energy. Japanese civilians noticed that Americans rarely sat still. They marched, shouted, laughed, built, and rebuilt. Many wondered if coffee itself was the reason. In the ashes of defeat, such thoughts carried an edge of awe and despair. The empire of tea had fallen to the empire of coffee. The deeper irony was that coffee had once been considered un-Japanese, even decadent. In the early 20th century, before the war, Western-style coffee houses had begun appearing in Tokyo and Osaka, frequented by students, writers, and cosmopolitans. But during the war, coffee vanished almost completely, branded a luxury of the West and forbidden by shortages. Now in 1945, it returned not as a choice but as a symbol of occupation. For many Japanese, tasting it for the first time was like tasting defeat itself, and yet it was impossible to ignore. Children begged American soldiers for candy and chocolate. Adults, though humiliated, began to sip coffee in small doses. Survival had stripped away pride. If coffee meant strength, then perhaps strength could be swallowed. From the American perspective, this cultural collision was barely noticed. To GIs, coffee was simply coffee. They joked about it, cursed when it was weak, demanded more when supplies ran low. They called it Joe, mud, or rocket fuel. They never imagined that the very act of drinking it was reshaping the perceptions of a defeated people. But for the Japanese, struggling to comprehend the scale of their loss, even these small details carried immense weight. The bitterness of coffee seemed to embody the bitterness of defeat. And yet, in its strength, they also saw a strange kind of promise. Perhaps this foreign fuel could help them rebuild, endure, and one day stand tall again. By the end of 1945, Japan stood at a crossroads. Tea remained the soul of the nation, but coffee had become the taste of survival in an occupied land. Each sip carried the memory of bombers in the sky, of soldiers on street corners, of voices speaking in a foreign tongue. It was alien, unsettling, and yet unforgettable. The war had ended with fire and surrender, but the next chapter of Japan's history would be shaped by quieter collisions, of culture, of ritual, of something as simple as what one poured into a cup at dawn winter. 1946. Snow fell quietly over Tokyo, muffling the rubble and softening the scars of war. The streets were still broken, lined with burnt-out shells of buildings, but life pressed forward, fragile and stubborn. In a crowded mess hall once belonging to the Imperial Army, now occupied by American forces, a curious scene unfolded. At one table, U.S. soldiers hunched over steaming tin mugs, black liquid rising in coils of vapor. At another, a small group of Japanese civilians sat hesitantly, hands wrapped around the same mugs, their faces tense with anticipation. They lifted the strange drink to their lips, bracing for the bitterness they now expected. But what struck them was not only the taste, it was the energy that followed. Hours later, while tea would have calmed and settled their nerves, coffee left them restless, awake, hearts pounding. For the first time, they realized the Americans' secret weapon wasn't just factories, machines, or steel. It was the invisible fuel in those battered mugs. The hidden advantage had been overlooked in the chaos of war. To Japan, strength came from discipline, unity, and centuries of tradition, but the Americans carried something intangible, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Coffee was more than a drink. It was an accelerant. It kept night shift workers in Detroit assembly lines, forging steel without pause. It fueled engineers drafting blueprints for tanks and aircraft through sleepless nights. It burned in the veins of sailors standing watch in the Pacific and air crews flying relentless missions. Coffee was the silent engine of American endurance. And when it arrived in occupied Japan, civilians tasted not just bitterness, but the hidden essence of a victorious nation. The Japanese military had never given coffee much attention. During the war, soldiers carried powdered green tea or roasted barley tea in their rations. These drinks soothed the stomach, provided warmth, and fit seamlessly into traditions of discipline and calm. But they did not jolt the senses, did not sharpen reflexes with the same ferocity. German soldiers had their beer and schnapps, the British their tea, the Russians their vodka. Yet none embraced coffee as thoroughly as the Americans. It was woven into their doctrine as surely as logistics, radio communication, or mechanization. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the deserts of North Africa, American troops fought with coffee at hand. They brewed it in helmets, in canteens, in battered pots over makeshift fires. It was crude, strong, and constant. Japanese civilians watching them drink saw not ceremony but compulsion. And in that compulsion lay a hidden power. For the first time in living memory, Japanese civilians began to think of beverages as strategy. If tea reflected patience and meditation, then coffee embodied motion and urgency. Where Japanese soldiers trained to conserve energy, Americans drank to create it. The contrast was jarring. Japanese veterans returning from the front remembered long nights in the jungles of Burma or the islands of the Pacific, exhausted, hungry, clutching tea that offered comfort, but no surge of strength. Now watching their conquerors drink coffee with the same casual need as air, they began to understand how an army could fight across oceans without collapsing. Coffee was not just nourishment, it was momentum in liquid form. The disbelief among civilians often turned to quiet envy. Mothers whispered to one another, no wonder they never seemed to tire. Factory workers, struggling to keep pace in rebuilding industries under American supervision, began to wonder if a cup of this black drink might help them last through another shift. Students trying to learn new lessons from foreign instructors discovered that coffee gave them the stamina to study past midnight. Slowly, the cultural resistance began to erode. What had seemed barbaric, gulping scalding liquid without pause, began to appear practical, even necessary. If tea had once represented refinement, coffee now represented survival. German prisoners of war held in Japan during earlier years had sometimes remarked on the same phenomenon. The Americans always demanded their coffee, no matter the situation. Even in chaos, even under fire, they found time to brew it. To the Japanese mind, this discipline of indulgence seemed contradictory. Yet it worked. The hidden advantage was not only in taste or caffeine, but in the unifying ritual. Soldiers shared coffee as they shared cigarettes, binding them together. Civilians began to sense this bond too. Tea was a symbol of harmony, yes, but it required formality. Coffee, by contrast, was blunt, direct, and communal. It united without ceremony. It built morale with speed. What the Japanese could not have known was the industrial machinery behind this hidden advantage. America had built entire supply chains around coffee. Factories roasted, packaged, and shipped it in mountains of tins. The Quartermaster Corps distributed it as carefully as ammunition. Soldiers were never far from their rations of Instant Joe. Compared to Japan's strained logistics, where even rice and fish had grown scarce, the abundance of coffee was staggering. Civilians saw crates unloaded at docks, marked with foreign symbols, stacked higher than men. Inside were not weapons, but the daily fuel of an empire. Coffee was everywhere, inexhaustible, and that abundance carried its own psychological weight. If the Americans could drink this endlessly, what else could they summon without limit? Reports circulated among civilians of American officers, boasting about the drink. "We run on coffee," one translator overheard. Without it, the whole army would grind to a halt. To Japanese ears, it sounded like a joke, and yet they knew it was not. They had watched with their own eyes. Soldiers who had fought through sleepless nights still marched with vigor at dawn, tin mugs in hand. Workers who had crossed the Pacific with convoys looked fresh after only hours of rest. It seemed impossible until one considered the steaming black liquid they consumed without end. For centuries, Japan's advantage had been cultural cohesion, the discipline of its warriors, the devotion of its people. But in the 20th century, war was no longer decided by tradition alone. It was decided by technology, industry, and endurance. Coffee had become, in its way, a weapon of endurance. And in the ruins of 1946, Japanese civilians confronted this truth with shock. Their tea was noble, graceful, sacred, but the Americans' coffee was stronger, not in ceremony but in consequence. It was the quiet strength that had powered an empire across oceans and now sat steaming in their very streets. In whispered conversations across Tokyo and Osaka, the same conclusion formed. Coffee was more than a drink. It was the hidden advantage of America's victory. Spring 1947. The cherry blossoms bloomed once again in Tokyo, pale petals drifting over scorched ruins that still bore the scars of firebombing. Yet amidst the rubble, life persisted. Children played barefoot in streets where shadows of wooden houses still lingered like ghosts. Market stalls reopened, selling scraps of vegetables, fish bones, and in rare luck, small bundles of tea. But something new had begun to creep into the rhythm of survival. Something carried not in porcelain bowls of jade-green liquid, but in heavy mugs of steaming black strength. Coffee, once alien and shocking, had begun its slow march into Japanese daily life, and with it came not only a new taste, but a story of engineering, industry, and the machinery of empire. The Americans had not stumbled upon coffee by accident. They had engineered its presence in every battlefield, every barracks, every ship. The US military knew that fatigue was the deadliest enemy of all. Men could be armed with rifles, trained in tactics, and armored with steel, but exhaustion could break them faster than bullets. Coffee was the antidote. Inside the standard GI ration kits of World War II, every soldier found packets of instant coffee. The most common brand, Nescafé, was produced in staggering quantities by Nestlé under government contract. By 1945, American factories were churning out over 1 million pounds of instant coffee each year, a logistical miracle as important as bullets and bread. The engineering behind this fuel was as fascinating as the tanks and planes that rolled off Detroit assembly lines. Instant coffee, a powder that dissolved instantly in hot water, was first perfected in the 1930s. By the time of the war, it had become lightweight, durable, and nearly indestructible. A single packet weighed less than an ounce, but delivered the caffeine equivalent of several cups of brewed coffee. Soldiers could prepare it anywhere, in helmets used as pots, in mess tins balanced over small fires, even in cold water when no heat was available. The process of freeze-drying, pioneered in America's laboratories, ensured that the coffee retained its potency for months, even years. Japanese civilians, who watched GIs pour powder into cups and stir once before drinking, were astonished. To them, the technology seemed like magic, the kind of industrial sorcery that had allowed America to dominate the war. Beyond instant coffee, the US military also shipped massive quantities of roasted beans. In bases from Okinawa to Yokohama, enormous grinders roared day and night, reducing mountains of beans into grounds that filled the air with an aroma both intoxicating and intimidating. The numbers told the story. During the war, American supply chains delivered nearly 250,000 tons of coffee to troops worldwide. Ships carrying Sherman tanks, Liberty trucks, and B-24 parts also carried sacks of Colombian and Brazilian beans packed tight in burlap. To the Japanese, who had struggled even to secure rice by 1945, the sight of such abundance was bewildering. How could a nation ship coffee across oceans as casually as if it were ammunition? The technical specifications spoke volumes. A single G coffee ration contained approximately 85 milligrams of caffeine, enough to keep a soldier awake through long nights of guard duty, By comparison, the roasted barley teas that Japanese soldiers consumed contained almost no caffeine at all. The American SCR-300 radios, with their constant crackle of transmissions, required alert operators around the clock. Coffee kept their hands steady, their minds sharp. Pilots preparing for missions drank it before takeoff. Tank crews, trapped in iron coffins for hours, used it to stay vigilant in suffocating heat. Infantrymen on the march brewed it at dawn to push through another day. The Japanese civilians watching all this saw not just a drink, but the invisible wiring of victory. Factories across America became part of this caffeine war machine. Nestlé's plants in New Jersey ran non-stop, producing Nescafé tins stamped with military codes. Maxwell House in New York churned out roasted beans by the ton. Even small regional roasters received contracts to ensure that every soldier, from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the jungles of New Guinea, had access to coffee. The US government declared coffee an essential war material, alongside steel, rubber, and oil. And unlike Japan, which struggled to supply its forces with the bare minimum, the United States ensured its soldiers had not only enough food, but enough coffee to remain sharp and motivated. To the Japanese mind, this level of planning was staggering. They had imagined war as a clash of swords and ships. Now they saw that it was also fought in factories, laboratories, and coffee plants. Even the equipment reflected American ingenuity. Field percolators were designed to brew gallons of coffee at once for entire companies of men. Large aluminum pots, nicknamed G.I. Joes, could be carried into the field and set up over makeshift fires. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had even distributed compact coffee kits that fit into soldiers' packs, a metal cup, packets of instant coffee, and sugar tablets. Japanese civilians, accustomed to delicate ceramic teaware, marveled at the rugged utility of these kits. They were built not for beauty, but for survival. And they worked. The contrast with Japan's wartime beverage supply could not have been more stark. Tea plantations in Shizuoka and Uji had been redirected to feed the war machine, but shortages crippled production. By 1943, rationing reduced the average family to a few grams of green tea per week. Many substituted roasted barley, chestnuts, or even pine needles. The taste was bitter, the effect negligible. Soldiers at the front lines often went without entirely. While American troops were drinking gallons of coffee every week, Japanese soldiers were lucky to sip thin barley broth. The difference in morale was immense. American soldiers spoke of coffee as a lifeline. Japanese soldiers spoke of thirst and deprivation. By 1947, Japanese civilians began to notice that coffee shops were reappearing in Tokyo, supplied not by local plantations, but by the surplus of American imports. These cafes, once fashionable before the war, now became symbols of survival and adaptation. Writers and students gathered in them, sipping cups of the same black drink they had once found unbearable. It was not only about taste, it was about joining the rhythm of the new era. Coffee was the drink of industry, of machines, of progress. And progress was what Japan needed most. The deeper truth was dawning. The Americans had not won by strength of arms alone. They had won through logistics, engineering, and an industrial base that could supply even the smallest comforts in abundance. Coffee was a symbol of that hidden advantage, brewed in every mess hall, carried in every ration pack, and now poured steaming into the cups of a defeated nation. To taste it was to taste the machinery of victory itself. September 19, 1944, the Lorraine region of France. Mist clung low to the fields as German panthers prowled cautiously through the village of Aricourt. Their engines rumbled, their thick armor gleamed with dew. The German crews, veterans of the Eastern Front, expected another easy triumph. After all, they sat inside the most feared tanks in Europe. Yet as the fog lifted, shadows flickered on the horizon. American Shermans appeared, then vanished only to strike from unexpected angles. Radio chatter filled the air, orders relayed instantly, coordination flawless. The Germans fired blind, their commanders shouting, their formations crumbling. When the smoke cleared, 39 German tanks lay wrecked, while the Americans lost just 7. In the reports that followed, the Germans were baffled. They could not comprehend how their opponents, with inferior tanks had maneuvered so effectively. But hidden inside each Sherman, humming faintly, was an invisible weapon: the FM radio. In occupied Japan, civilians heard whispers of these same advantages. They had seen America's abundance of coffee, but coffee was only one piece of a far larger puzzle. The real secret lay in how the Americans turned small advantages into overwhelming power. The Japanese had fought with courage and tradition, but the Americans fought with networks of industry, of supply, and of communication. Just as coffee bound soldiers together with shared energy, radios bound entire armies together with shared awareness. Civilians could not yet see the circuits and vacuum tubes inside those mysterious boxes, but they felt the results in every battle lost, in every city burned. The SCR-508 radio was standard inside American tanks. Weighing nearly 200 pounds, it carried a range of 8 to 15 miles, crystal clear, unaffected by the static that plagued German AM systems. Every tank from Sherman to Hellcat carried one. Commanders spoke. Subordinates heard instantly, and units responded like a single organism. German crews, by contrast, often lacked radios entirely. Orders were signaled with flags or shouted between vehicles. In the chaos of battle, that difference was decisive. At Aracourt, American tankers disappeared into fog, coordinated their movements, then reappeared behind German flanks. The Germans wrote bitterly that it seemed as though the Americans had eyes everywhere. What they truly had was connection. For Japanese civilians watching the occupation, the lesson was profound. During the war, their own soldiers had often fought isolated, with little more than shouted orders or handwritten dispatches. Radio technology had been limited, scarce, and fragile. Now they saw the Americans with portable sets slung over their shoulders, voices carrying across ruined neighborhoods, their words clear and immediate. It was not only tanks that had been connected. It was entire armies, entire fleets, entire nations. Just as coffee gave stamina, radios gave cohesion. And cohesion, more than brute strength, explained why the United States could fight across the world and never collapse. The technology itself was staggering. The SCR-508 contained more than 2,700 individual components: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, all assembled in American factories running day and night. Each unit delivered 25 watts of power, twice the output of the German Fuji-5, and its frequency modulation cut through interference with precision. Motorola, Bendix, and other US firms produced them by the tens of thousands, shipping them overseas with the same efficiency that delivered coffee and cigarettes. Japanese engineers, allowed glimpses of the equipment during the occupation, were astonished. These were not just radios. They were weapons of coordination. The impact was felt not only on the battlefield, but in psychology. German tankers described the terror of fighting an enemy that seemed to vanish and reappear at will. Japanese civilians, reading translated reports, recognized that same terror in their own soldiers' stories from Guadalcanal and Leyte. American units did not fight as scattered groups. They fought as a web, each part tied to the other, each soldier able to call for support within seconds. To the Japanese, raised in a culture that prized discipline and hierarchy, it was shocking to see a system where even lower-ranking soldiers could transmit information and receive orders instantly. Authority flowed not just from the top, but through the entire network. The first major demonstration of this advantage came in North Africa in 1942, when German forces at Kasserine Pass initially drove the Americans back. But within days, the tide shifted. American units reorganized, their radios allowing commanders to redirect forces with speed the Germans could not match. By Tunisia, the Germans faced an opponent whose coordination improved with every skirmish. Civilians in Japan would only learn of these battles after the war, but by then the pattern was clear. America had not simply outproduced its enemies, it had outcommunicated them. Even in the Pacific, radios proved decisive. During the island-hopping campaigns, Marines called in artillery and airstrikes with terrifying accuracy. Japanese defenders, cut off from reinforcements, had no such lifeline. Their commanders often fought blind, their courage wasted in isolation. Civilians now understood why their soldiers had described battles where American artillery seemed to fall like divine thunder, always at the right place, always at the right time. It was not luck. It was the unseen hum of radios, binding every weapon into a single killing machine. The comparison to coffee was not lost on them. Coffee had seemed like a crude stimulant, but in truth it symbolized an American philosophy, that war was fought not by individuals, but by networks, fueled and connected in ways their enemies could scarcely imagine. Radios were the technical counterpart to that philosophy. They turned armies into organisms, moving as one, striking with precision. For the Japanese, who had placed faith in the individual spirit of the warrior, the realization was bitter. Spirit alone could not overcome connection. Tradition alone could not defeat coordination. As the occupation continued, Japanese engineers studied American equipment with growing fascination. The radios, the vehicles, even the supply systems were dissected and analyzed. Many realized that these were not simply tools of war, but glimpses into the future. A world where information flowed faster than strength, where connection mattered more than armor. Just as civilians had once whispered in awe that American coffee was stronger than tea, now they whispered that American radios were stronger than swords. The wreckage of the war lay everywhere, but within it, the seeds of a new understanding began to take root. Victory had not come from sheer numbers alone. It had come from hidden advantages, engineered in factories, distributed with precision, and deployed with ruthless efficiency. Coffee was one such advantage. Radios were another. Together they revealed the deeper truth. In modern war, victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the best connected. Summer, 1945, Okinawa. The last great battle of the Pacific had ended in thunder and fire. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The Americans, too, had bled terribly, but they stood victorious, their flag planted high. From the shattered cliffs of Shuri Castle to the bloodied beaches of Naha, the Japanese defenders had fought to the last breath. And yet, amid the silence that followed, civilians began whispering the same question. How had the Americans endured? How had they pressed forward day after day, when exhaustion and despair should have broken them? Some pointed to their endless supplies, others to their swarming machines. But many, watching closely, noticed something subtler. Every morning, before advancing into the storm, the Americans gathered in small circles. They boiled water, poured powder, stirred. Then they drank the same black liquid that had so unsettled Tokyo only months before. Coffee. To the Japanese, it seemed like sorcery, as if this bitter potion gave soldiers the strength to march into hell itself. By 1945, the psychological impact of coffee was as real as any weapon. For American soldiers, it was comfort, ritual, and resilience wrapped into one. In foxholes, men spoke of it as salvation. Letters home mentioned coffee as often as bullets. A mug of steaming liquid in the mud meant more than warmth. It meant survival. For Japanese civilians encountering this ritual after surrender, the contrast to their own traditions was haunting. Tea had always been about calm reflection. Coffee, by contrast, seemed like bottled defiance. It demanded wakefulness, sharpened nerves, and turned weariness into drive. In the occupied cities, this difference became a symbol. America drank to fight. Japan drank to endure. And in the ruins of war, endurance alone had not been enough. The psychological toll on the defeated was immense. Many civilians began to associate coffee not only with strength, but with humiliation. To sip it was to acknowledge the power of the conqueror. Mothers recalled watching American soldiers gulp down mugs before patrolling ruined neighborhoods, their laughter echoing among the ashes. Children begged for a taste, drawn by the exotic smell. Fathers, broken by defeat, turned away, unwilling to admit fascination with the drink of their enemies. Yet the reality could not be denied. Coffee embodied the very energy Japan lacked in its final days of war. It became both a symbol of defeat and a mirror of what had been missing. German after-action reports from Europe echoed this same psychological torment. Panzer crews described the Americans as relentless, always reorganizing, always striking back with speed. They seemed tireless, one German officer wrote in 1944, as if some hidden force pushes them forward. In occupied Japan, when translated versions of such documents circulated among intellectuals, many connected the dots. Coffee had been that hidden force, not mystical but practical. It had sustained industries that never slept, soldiers who never faltered, and commanders who never hesitated. To the Japanese it was a revelation. Their empire had relied on spirit. The Americans had relied on fuel, both for machines and for men. The strategic impact rippled beyond the battlefield. American units, fueled by coffee and bound by radio, could recover morale quickly, even after devastating losses. At Kasserine Pass in 1943, their first clash with German veterans had ended in disaster. Yet within days, reorganized and reinforced, they surged forward again. German commanders were stunned. They expected hesitation. Instead, they faced renewed momentum. Japanese civilians studying these histories realized the same pattern described their own war. Battles at Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, each should have broken the invaders. Yet the Americans returned, restless, relentless, like the bitter taste of the drink they carried everywhere. The psychological impact extended to civilians as well. In the ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, coffee became a quiet symbol of modernity. Those who sipped it, students, writers, rebuilding workers, felt, if only for a moment, that they were borrowing American strength. It became a way to cope with humiliation, to channel bitterness into energy. In cafes that reopened under occupation, intellectuals debated the future of Japan over steaming mugs, their nerves jangling with caffeine. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Tea was the drink of the past, rooted in tradition. Coffee was the drink of the future, tied to industry, speed, and the West. To embrace it was to embrace survival in a new world order, yet not everyone welcomed this shift. Among the older generations, coffee was seen as corrosive, even dangerous. They feared it would erode Japan's spirit, replacing harmony with haste. Some argued that the bitterness of coffee mirrored the bitterness of defeat, a constant reminder of humiliation. And yet as time passed, resistance softened. Necessity outweighed pride. Workers needed the jolt to rebuild factories. Students needed it to cram late into the night. Even soldiers demobilized from the Imperial Army, struggling to find purpose, began to drink coffee as they sought employment in the new American-shaped economy. What began as humiliation turned slowly into adaptation. The Americans themselves were largely oblivious to this psychological storm. To them, coffee was simply part of life. But in the eyes of the conquered, it was proof of something greater, that America's victory came not only from weapons, but from the small, daily habits that gave their society its relentless drive. In whispered conversations, Japanese civilians began to admit the unthinkable, that perhaps the conqueror's drink contained a lesson. Perhaps victory did not belong to those with the strongest spirit, but to those who kept moving, who stayed awake, who never stopped. The legacy of this psychological shift would endure long after the last American transports departed. Coffee, once alien, became integrated into Japan's culture of resilience. The bitterness that once symbolized defeat became, in time, a reminder of endurance. For the veterans, for the workers, for the students, it became fuel for survival. And as Japan rose from the ashes to rebuild into a modern power, many would look back and realize the taste of that survival was not the calm of tea, but the sharp, unyielding bite of coffee. Spring, 1951. The streets of Tokyo no longer looked like ruins. Neon lights flickered above storefronts, tramcars rattled down rebuilt tracks, and cafes buzzed with the hum of conversation. The occupation was drawing to a close, and Japan was slowly standing again on its own feet. In the heart of this transformation, one quiet symbol of change sat steaming on every cafe table: coffee. What had once been an alien invader's fuel had become a familiar companion, woven into the fabric of a nation rebuilding itself. Yet its journey from bitter shock to daily ritual told a larger story, not just of taste, but of survival, resilience, and the transformation of an entire culture in the wake of total war. The legacy of coffee was inseparable from the legacy of defeat. For Japanese civilians, the first sip in 1945 had been unforgettable, a taste stronger, harsher, more demanding than anything they had known. It was bitter, yes, but it was also alive, urgent, a reflection of the power that had crushed their empire. At first it symbolized humiliation, the black liquid of the conquerors. But as years passed, that bitterness became tied to endurance. Coffee became the taste of studying by candlelight, of rebuilding factories through the night, of adapting to a world that moved faster than ceremony allowed. It became the liquid metaphor for survival in a new era, where strength came not from reflection, but from momentum. The shift was profound. Tea remained Japan's soul, its ritual, its heritage, but coffee became its modern face. the drink of workers, students, and dreamers. In Shinjuku and Ginza, jazz cafes flourished, filled with young men and women sipping dark brews as American records played on turntables. Writers penned stories over cups of coffee, their words jittering with caffeine and modern anxiety. Engineers tasked with rebuilding industries destroyed by war fueled themselves with coffee during long shifts in factories humming with new machines. Coffee was not just a foreign drink now. It was a bridge, a tool, a survival mechanism. On the global stage, its symbolism was just as clear. The Americans had taught Japan that war was not only about weapons and spirit, but about logistics, industry, and the invisible fuel that kept soldiers and workers moving. Coffee had been one of those fuels, no less important than radios, tanks, or aircraft carriers. It had been a weapon of endurance, one cup at a time, and as Japan rebuilt, it carried that lesson forward. In the 1950s and 60s, Japanese companies would build their own coffee empires, importing beans from Brazil, roasting them in Tokyo, and selling them in vending machines across the nation. What had once been a symbol of foreign dominance became, remarkably, an industry of Japanese strength. The cultural memory of those first encounters never faded. Older generations still remembered the shock of seeing Americans gulp coffee like water, the disbelief that such a bitter drink could bring strength. Veterans recalled watching GIs brew coffee even under fire, a ritual as constant as loading rifles. Children remembered the smell drifting through ruined streets, a smell that meant both fear and fascination. And as these memories blended into history, they carried a lesson. Strength was not always visible in steel or fire. Sometimes it was hidden in the simplest rituals, the smallest comforts, the quietest fuels. The psychological shift endured as well. Japan, once rooted in patience and ceremony, now learned to thrive on urgency and endurance. Coffee became the drink of late nights in universities, of engineers pushing deadlines, of workers commuting through the neon-lit rush of Tokyo's rebirth. In the Cold War era, when Japan rose as an economic titan, the image of the businessman with a steaming cup of coffee became as iconic as the samurai with his blade centuries earlier. The drink of the conquerors had been transformed into the fuel of the rebuilt nation. Even the Americans recognized this irony. Veterans returning decades later were astonished to see vending machines dispensing cans of iced coffee on every corner, cafes filled with students scribbling notes over espresso, and businessmen clutching thermoses on commuter trains. What had once been their secret fuel was now part of Japan's identity. It was no longer foreign. It was Japanese. The story of coffee in Japan was not merely about taste, it was about adaptation. It was about how a defeated people absorbed even the smallest details of their conquerors' habits, reshaped them, and made them their own. In the ashes of empire, when tea seemed too fragile to carry the burden of survival, coffee stepped in, bitter, unyielding, and strong. In the end, the lesson was universal. Wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by endurance, by connection, by the hidden fuels that keep societies moving. The Americans had coffee, and with it they marched across oceans and crushed empires. The Japanese, defeated, tasted that same bitterness, and from it, they learned to rise again. And so the final truth lingered in every steaming cup. In modern war and modern life, connection outweighs isolation, and endurance defeats tradition. Coffee had been stronger than tea, not because it erased Japan's culture, but because it carried the lesson Japan needed most, that in order to survive, a nation must adapt, must draw strength from every source. Even the bitterest, on the streets of post-war Tokyo, as neon lights reflected in the black surface of 1,000 cups, the message was clear. Victory and survival alike are brewed not only in steel and fire, but in what a people choose to pour into their cups each morning.